Hello everyone, my name is Alex. Previously we were modeling spaceship for an animation like this. In this part we will create space environment. Okay, let's move on. We start with creating Starfield. Open shader editor and switch data type to world. You can see currently we have basic gray background. Move viewport to the left. We'll add our nodes here. Let's add procedural Runway texture node. I think it's best for generating stars. Duplicate node, we'll use it to create second layer of smaller stars. Set scale of the first node to 50. And here set it to 100, so stars will be twice as small. Now add color ramp node. To turn Runway texture into stars we'll need to use gradient to remap colors. Connect Runway texture with the color ramp VAC input. Switch gradient mode to be spline to make stars fall off smoother. Let's clean up space for even more nodes. You'll have to tweak second texture as well, but in slightly different way. Duplicate color ramp we've just added. Now let's blend both textures together using Mix RGB node. Connect both color ramps with these input sockets. Then connect Mix node output with our background shader, and switch its blend mode to add. We'll fine-tune these intensity values a bit later. It's time to tweak gradient of color ramp. Look what happens when I'm moving the slider. At the moment you can't see much difference, that's because we're in orthogonal projection and it's not good for seeing background textures. Just remember we must make most of texture black, and only tiny fraction of colors white. This way we'll have black background with drops of stars. Let's move to perspective view to see what we've got. Now you can see we have lots of big and small stars on the background. But hey, they all look dull like specks of dust. To fix that we need to crank up background strength up to 40. Now let's go back to the gradient ramp and adjust their fall off. Watch closely what slider values I'm entering. This time you should be very precise because stars are so tiny and we don't have room for a mistake. With B-spline we need to have two black gradient stops closely to ensure fast fall off. Otherwise you'll see gray color bleeding outside. Now let's tweak gradient for small stars. It will be much faster if we duplicate what we've just done with big stars, so copy that node and reconnect it with the color mix node. We want small stars to be less bright, so change the color mixing factor to a very small value. Like 0.025. So this is our setup for stars. It's fascinating how much you can achieve with just a few nodes. Let's go back to the viewport to take a look around. I think background looks really great now. Okay, let's create a runway our spaceship will fly through. Start by creating plane and moving it 40 units behind the ship. Pay close attention to where I'll be putting meshes. Precision is very important if you want your animation loop seamlessly. Now resize it to be 10 units wide. Create new material and let's call it Hull Blue Dim. Dim because we'll make it less bright than other objects in the scene. Go to the shader editor and switch from world back to object type. Add image texture node. We will reuse same hull texture we have imported before. You remember we had way more shapes there. Connect it to the emission socket of principled BSDF material. Let's change base color to be blue, and increase metallic slider to make it shiny just like our spaceship. But this time set specular and roughness to be 0. We want it to be smooth like mirror but less reflective. Now switch to UV editor. We need to map our plane to one of those blue squares we have on the texture. You see, this particular square has slightly more blurred edges in one direction. This will create effective motion blur when our spaceship moves forward along the runway track. Okay, now go back to the shader editor. Remember we called our shader dim? Now we need to make it less bright. To do that, add color mix node. Change its color to black. Switch color blend mode to multiply. And let's adjust a FAC slider to make it dimmer but not completely black. We also need to change texture filter mode to closest so it looks sharp. Finally we can start building the scene our spaceship will fly through. Now duplicate this square a few times to create first row of our runway. 2 squares will be at floor level. Resize third square to be half wide. Switch to front orthographic view and make sure our row of squares goes at 0 coordinate by z-axis. Snap all vertices to grid just to be sure. Now take left edge of that half-wide square and move it up for about 10 units. That's right, we've just created border around our runway. Select this square, duplicate it and move it here to create upper floor. Switch to the front view to move it up. OK, now duplicate it few more times and place to the left. Let's switch to perspective view to check what we have so far. Looks nice. Let's mirror this geometry to make runway symmetric. Very good, now we need to make this runway last till the horizon. To do that, let's add an array modifier. We need to set relative offset by y-axis to 1. You can see now we have second row of runway placed right in front with no gaps. Increase count value to 480 to make it very long. Now this is something that looks like infinite runway. Let's spice it up by adding more buildings around. First we will create some small buildings on upper floor of the runway. We can reuse floor squares for that. Select this square and duplicate it. Let's switch to wireframe mode to see our geometry better. Move it up and place on a grid. Now press P to cut it out into a separate mesh. See, all the modifiers were copied as well, let's get rid of them for now. Switch to front orthogonal view, duplicate face and press R to rotate it 90 degrees. Place it to the right to create a side face of a cube. Now switch to UV editor with top face selected. And let's remap it to a smaller square to make texture edges wider. Imagine doing that for each side after cube was already created. Now if we think it will be much easier to copy already UV remapped face than readjust each face manually. So let's get rid of that side face we created previously, and duplicate top face one more time. Continue building cube sides by using this amazing technique. Now you can select both side faces and copy them at once to finalize our cube. Select all vertices and merge them by distance to fuse all faces together. Select bottom right vertex and snap 3D cursor to it. Then go to Set Origin menu, Origin to 3D cursor. We do that to simplify placement of buildings for us as we move on. Now let's make all buildings stand out. Switch to Shader Editor. And duplicate dim hull shader we have copied from the ground mesh. Rename it to just Hull Blue. Let's get rid of that multiply color node and connect texture straight to the emission socket. See how cube looks much brighter now. It's time to get back to the array modifier to make many copies of the building we've just created. Set relative offset factor x to 0. And factor y to 8. It will place copies of that cube 8 grid cells apart. Don't forget to increase count value to something like 60 so buildings go to the horizon along the runway edge. Okay, now let's reuse the same cube to create another type of buildings, this time a bit taller. Press Shift and D to make a copy, and move it left, closer to the runway edge. Switch to the edit mode and turn on wireframe. Select top row of vertices and move them up by 10 units. Now go back to the UV editor to fix texture stretching on sides of the cube. Select all 4 faces. And let's check if they are properly aligned on the UV layout. Okay, we need to rotate them 90 degrees. Now remap them to a rectangle we have right here. Just like that. Looks nice and tidy now. Let's move it 2 grid cells forward so we have some variation between buildings. Change count value to 80 so they are visible from even greater distance. Now let's create even taller buildings. Press Shift and D to make another copy of the selected building, and move it forward 2 grid cells. Okay, now switch to edit mode and turn on wireframe view to see through the building in front. Move top vertices up for 10 units more, we need to repeat same operation we did previously. Select all side faces using Loop Select tool and go to UV Editor to remap them to a bigger rectangle. Luckily, this time all faces are properly aligned and we don't need to double check or rotate them. Go to the array modifier and set count value to 40. Why less, you ask? Because we don't want to see tall buildings that often. Change relative offset factor y to 16. Simple math, we decrease their count 2 times, and increase distance between them 2 times as well. Okay, now let's copy what we have on the left runway side and move it to the right side. Why wouldn't we just use mirror modifier we used before? That's because we'll have to put origin of each object to the runway center for this to work. It would be weird and that's not something we want. So this time just copying meshes is the simplest way. Let's check one more time how our scenery would look like from spaceship point of view. See how these buildings are making runway look more intriguing? Just wait till we animate it, you'd get surprised how much value we've just created with such a simple addition. If we take a closer look, runway tunnel looks quite boring right now. Let's fix that by putting some obstacles in it. Select the building we created previously and press Shift and D to make a copy. Place it in the tunnel by the inner wall and move it down till it hits the floor. Okay, we don't need it be as big as it was before, let's resize it down to be 5 units wide. And now skew it to follow inclination of the side wall. These polygons already look so spicy, oh boy. Let's switch to the rendered mode and see what we've got so far. We can remap this front face to a square which has blurred edges. Move one of the edges to check that orientation is correct. Blurred edges should be oriented horizontally along flight path of the spaceship. It's good we don't need to change array modifier or material we've copied along as it looks just fine. Press Shift and D to duplicate side wall and drag it across the runway to the other side. Now select top face, switch to top orthographic view, and move it over side wall to fix inclination. Looks much better now, how do you think? Tell me in the comments below. So what we're gonna do next? I think it's time to add more fascinating objects to the background. What can be more fascinating than a huge moon sitting above our runway? Let's start by adding a circle mesh. Here we have circle generator properties. Set fill type to triangle fan, this is how it's gonna fill up the circle space. So where's is our circle? Right, we created it where our 3D cursor is. Let's move it back here so we have a better view of what we're doing. Snap circle to the grid, remember we need everything to be precise. Okay, we need to zoom out and snap it one more time so it sticks to a bigger grid units. Now switch to edit mode and start scaling it up till it's about 14 units wide. I'll turn off display of edge lengths, it looks too messy when there are way too many faces. Let's create a new material and call it the moon. Go to the shader editor. Okay, we have default material nodes here. Set metallic and specular to 0, we don't want any reflections on the surface. Add new image texture node. I'm gonna load moon texture I have prepared for the tutorial. You can easily find high-resolution moon textures in Google. Connect texture output to the base color socket in the material node. Now to see anything you also need to connect it to emission as well. That's better. Let's go to the UV editor, we want to get rid of that black circle around the moon texture. Select all UVs and scale them down to the center so they cover exactly the moon shape and not the black space around. Make sure transformation pivot is set to bounding box, not 3D cursor or anything else. Okay, I think it's good enough. Now let's go back to the shader editor. Remember in the previous part we used color mix node to increase emission strength? Let's do the same for the moon. Switch blend mode to add. And connect texture to the second input to blend it with itself. Let's slightly decrease blending factor to around 0.2. Okay, now we have to put our moon to the background. First of all, move it down to sit precisely at 0 point by z-axis. Press R and rotate it 90 degrees counterclockwise so it faces our spaceship. Now instead of using grab tool to move it back manually, let's type an exact value in the location input right here. Let's try something huge like 5,700 units. Wow, moon totally disappeared. But where did it go? I think we need to increase camera view clipping limit so we can see it again. Go to the view tool properties, and look for clip end. See? It's only 1,000 but we've just set our moon to be 5,000 units away. Let's increase clipping limit to be sure. Still can't see it, can you figure out why? Oh, because it's too small. We still have our moon selected, press tab to switch to the edit mode, then we press S to scale it up. Now that's what we wanted. Let's put it slightly above the ground, so set location Z value to 5 units. I think it's a great time to set up our camera. Now we have our main objects present on the scene, so we can easily go and look for a best angle to capture all of them. Let's switch to wireframe to see where's our camera at. Now select and reset its location and rotation by pressing Alt-G and Alt-R. Rotate it 90 degrees counterclockwise to look forward along the runway straight to the moon. Press Ctrl to snap objects to grid, move it 12 units behind the spaceship. And 8 units above. Our camera should see both the spaceship and the moon in the background. Now let's go to the camera properties and switch lens unit to field of view. I find it easier for understanding. Increase value of field of view to 105 degrees, this way camera will capture most of the scene. Look at that, our camera can see only a fraction of our runway. Go and fix that by increasing clip end value up to 10,000. Let's also decrease sensor size down to 32. Unfortunately, angle of field of view parameter cannot be animated with keyframes. That's why we'll use sensor size. Fortunately, it does almost the same. Now go to Render Properties. And let's turn on Ambient Occlusion. We'll leave default settings for this effect. Anyway, it's almost unnoticeable on this scene. Also activate Bloom Effect. Now here we want to decrease threshold down to 0.4 to give our scene more of a fantasy look. Decrease bloom radius down to 4. And increase intensity up to 0.2. Turn on screen space reflection so we can see our moon mirroring off the floor surface. Now scroll down to bottom and change View Transform from Filmic to Standard on the Color Management panel. This should increase contrast of our scene and make all colors more vivid. Have you noticed something strange? Why our spaceship has only one nozzle? I guess that's because we accidentally buried it underground. Let's first select both exhausts and press Ctrl P to parent them to the spaceship hull. Now move spaceship 5 units up. Okay, let's scale up moon even more. I'll turn on edge lengths back so you can pick up the right size. Press S to scale and drag mouse until we have moon radius of about 3,700 units. Now snap 3D cursor to our spaceship. We're gonna create atmospheric haze to make our scene even more beautiful. Press Shift A and add a new circle mesh. Now let's switch to the edit mode and scale up our circle about 40 times. Press E to extrude all vertices and scale them down. Press M and select collapse to join them at center. Let's scale up circle one more time. And move all vertices down so we have origin of this mesh at one of circumference points. We do that to scale it later against the origin. Now press G to activate grab tool and move it closer to the runway end. Let's put it 32 units below the ground. Now we want to scale it up to contain whole runway. Snap 3D cursor to the origin of our circle, and change transformation pivot to 3D cursor as well. Select all vertices and scale them up until circle is enclosing whole our scene with the spaceship. Now select center vertex and remove it. Switch to front orthographic view, and press E to extrude all circle vertices. Let's see from the camera view how high we need to move them to cover whole background. Okay, here I think it's about right. Let's create a new material, and call it atmosphere. Forgive me my typos, it's really a hard word to fill in when you have tasty donut in one hand. Now we go to the shader editor. We'll try to create setup pretty much similar to the exhaust effect. So let's start by adding a texture coordinate node. And a gradient texture. Connect UV output of the texture coordinate with vector socket of the texture node. Now let's add a color ramp node to have a better control of gradient colors. Since we are creating atmospheric haze, let's put a light blue color at this gradient stop. Change gradient interpolation mode to be spline to have a smoother blending of colors. Enter 0.218 in the position field of the second gradient stop. And make its color deep blue. We need a third point around here. Put it at 0.618 position. As for these two last points, color them pitch black. Now connect color output with the emission socket of our shader and let's observe the result. We see that it's bright cyan at the moment. This is probably because we haven't unwrapped it yet. Let's switch to wireframe and check if normals are pointing inside. To do that, switch to face selection mode, go to viewport overlays menu, and turn on display of face normals. Also increase display size to about 100 so we can see them on such a huge mesh. Okay, it seems like normals are pointing inside, just like we want them. Now let's switch to the UV editor and see what we've got there. It appears that all faces are mapped to a tiny corner. Let's reproject them from view. Scale UV region to fit whole layout. We can see that gradient goes from left to right, not what we want. So let's rotate the region 90 degrees clockwise to fix that. Okay, looks decent now. But we can't see any stars much. This is because our gradient is not transparent. Let's go back to the shader editor. Add one more color ramp node. And switch gradient interpolation mode to be spline. Change color of the first color stop to white. Move second color stop to somewhere near middle. And change its color to black. Take color output of gradient texture and connect it with fact socket of the color ramp node. Now connect color output with alpha socket of our shader. Still nothing. That's because we need to go here and change shader blend mode from opaque to alpha blend explicitly. Also make sure that shadow mode is set to none, we don't need any shadows to be cast from atmospheric haze. Now we can see all the stars. Select all faces and set their shading mode to smooth, it should smooth their normals as well. Now let's create some obstacles on the course. We can reuse same blocks we have created before. Press Shift D to duplicate them, and drag over the runway. We don't need array modifier at the moment. Now we want this obstacle to be one grid cell away from the fourth sidewall section from the runway start. Move it right to be exactly over grid cell. And 1 unit down to sit on the runway floor. Now let's create a material for our obstacles. We want them to be red, so let's duplicate hull shader we've previously created for the spaceship. Rename it to block. Now we need to remap all faces to a red square on the hull texture. Go to the shader editor. And let's make its base color a bit darker. OK, and now set specular and roughness to be 0. We want to make sure obstacles are very noticeable, so let's unplug texture from the second socket of color mix node. And set blend color to red. Also decrease blend factor to something very small, like this value. We're done with the shader, let's go back to the UV editor. Now we don't have red square with blurred edges in our texture, but we can fake it by remapping side faces to a wide rectangle like here. OK, now select all faces, duplicate them, and let's create a thinner wall to fill the gap between runway side and our obstacle. Select opposite face and move it right to be half grid cell wide. Now we want to remap these faces to a rectangle down here to fix edge widths. Rotate these UVs to align with the rectangle. Press Ctrl L to select all linked faces, duplicate them and move to the opposite side. Let's disable display of face normals, we don't need them anymore. Duplicate the cube one more time and place it to the right. Now go back to that thin wall in the gap, select all linked faces by pressing Ctrl L, duplicate and move it across the runway to fill this hole we have left. OK, these obstacles look quite boring now. Let's give them one remarkable feature to tell them apart from regular blocks. Select front face and press Ctrl R to active loop cut tool, slice it up vertically and horizontally. Now select this corner, switch to the top view, and hit E to extrude it forward for 1 unit. Hit S and type 0.7 on the numpad to scale it down. Let's fix UVs of panel faces we've just created. Select all of them, hit U and choose Reset from the list. Scale down these faces and map them over smallest red square we have on the texture. Let's select and delete other faces, we're going to replace them with copies of the panel. Now go back, select all faces, press Shift D to duplicate it, and keep copying to fill up all the front surfaces of our obstacles. Use Grab tool to move them around, and press Z or X to lock movement to a certain axis. Hold Ctrl key pressed while moving faces to snap them to grid. Now let's get back to the modifier stack and add array modifier. This time we need constant offset, set distance by y-axis to 640 units. Now we want to create a second variation of our obstacles. Switch to top view and make a copy of the obstacle we've just created, and move it forward for 320 units. Now all we left to do is to switch places for the gap in between. Select this obstacle piece and move it left for 1 grid cell. Well done, partner. You did a tremendous work and our scene is finally ready to animate, and in the next part I will show you how. As always, have a nice day, and follow for more.